2014, the Raptors drafted a small forward out of UConn by the name of DeAndre Daniels with the 37th pick. He played a few games in summer league, airballed a few threes, made some threes, and then could not make the team and got shipped over to Australia, where he played for the Perth Wildcats. And nobody in Toronto certainly knows much about what goes on down there. So to help us tell us what DeAndre Daniels has been up to and what the state of the Australian Basketball League is, I'm joined by Chris Robinson from the Sunday Times. Hello, Chris.
Yeah, hi, Zara. How are you going?
Good. Curious, I should say. Curious about a lot of things. We'll get to DeAndre Daniels in a bit, but let's talk about the Australian League. What is it? Just explain to us what the Australian League is and how it's set up. Give us an overview.
Yeah, not a problem. So it's probably the predominant league in Oceania. It's of reasonable quality. I mean, Australia, as a nation, is ranked just outside the top 10 in the FIBA rankings. I think they're 11th at the moment, and most players in that national setup have been through the NBL, which is what the league's called, at some stage. It's a bit of a physical league. It's probably a step or two below sort of the top European leagues. You're probably more likely to see great fundamentals over a truckload of athleticism, but it's certainly of a reasonable standard. There's 8 teams. The top 4 make the playoffs in a sort of 1v4, 2v3, and there's best of 3 series across the board. So, but yeah, it is quite a quality league. I mean, in recent times here, we've had a few players who have come from the NBA. Josh Childress, who is an NBA role player that I'm sure you're familiar with for many a year, came here last season, led the league in scoring. Johnny Flynn, who was actually picked at 6 in the 09 draft, one pick before Steph Curry, who just got named MVP. He came here a couple of seasons ago, and we've also had players go the other way. Joe Ingles, who's an Australian player who was just finished his rookie season with the Jazz, played a good 3 or 4 years here. We saw James Ennis with the Perth Wildcats last season. He's become a role player with the Heat. So we've sort of had players that have had NBA exposure either come here after the NBA or get ready here and take off to the NBA. So it is quite a reasonable standard here in Australia.
And has the league grown? Like, when did it start? And has it always been 8 teams, or has it expanded to 8 teams?
No, it's actually shrunk a little bit, to be honest. It started in 1979, and it's seen a few teams come and go. 8 teams is the lowest amount of teams that it's had. It's been at 8 for a few years now. Traditionally, it's sort of hovered around 9, 10, 11 sort of teams, but a couple have fallen on hard times recently, and there's talk of expansion as far as not this coming season goes, but the season after that, looking to expand into 1 or 2 more markets. So ideally, I think the league bosses are sort of looking at about a 10, maybe 11 or 12 sort of team league, but at the moment it's currently sitting at 8.
So how does basketball rank in Australia? I'm going to assume that cricket is number 1 and soccer is number 2, or rugby is number 2. Do you want to rank where basketball ranks in Australia?
Yeah, not a problem. Over our winter, which is what we're just going into now, Australian rules football and rugby league are sort of the 2 king sports. But over summer, our basketball league is played over summer. It does have a hard time competing with cricket. Cricket is the number 1 sport in summer, and then basketball is probably a rung behind soccer. Maybe the number 3 sport over summer, and sort of competes with soccer and cricket and a bit of tennis as well.
Right, so let's get to DeAndre Daniels. So the Raptors picked him with some hopes. As you know, probably the second round picks, there's not much expected of them. They get drafted into the league with no contract, no guaranteed money whatsoever. They usually get an invite to summer league. And you really have to impress over summer to get an invite to training camp. And if you succeed in training camp, you'll make the roster. But really, it's the success rate for that is fairly low. And DeAndre Daniels, when he was drafted with the 37th pick, kind of fell victim to that. There was some competition with the Raptors with Terrence Ross and the newly signed James Johnson, and he kind of fell by the wayside and was promptly shipped to Australia. So how much of the Perth Wildcats have you seen this year, and what were your early impressions when Daniels first came into the league?
Yeah, look, I've seen every game that Perth play. There's 28 games in the regular season, and then Perth was actually knocked out or swept in the first round. So they played 2 playoff games. So
much like the Raptors.
Indeed, absolutely. There were high hopes during the regular season, and then much like the Raptors, they went out of the playoffs without a bang. So it was very, very similar, in fact. But yeah, DeAndre, there were plenty of expectations on DeAndre when he came to Perth, and a large part of that is James Ennis, because Ennis was DeAndre's predecessor. He was the number 1 offensive option when he came to Perth for his one season. The season before last, was finished 3rd in the league's MVP voting, and many considered he was very unlucky not to have won that award. And Perth won the title that season, and then of course now we've seen us go on to Miami, become somewhat of a decent role player. A few highlights he's generated as well in his time here, and also in his brief time in the NBA as well. So there were plenty of expectations on DeAndre Daniels when he did come to Perth that he would be the new James Ennis, sort of take that mantle as the number 1 offensive option, provide plenty of highlights with athleticism and all the rest of it, and also lead Perth to, hopefully for the fans, another title. They were pre-season favourites for the championship. Unfortunately, that didn't quite go to plan. Perth was hit by a significant range of injuries, particularly late in the season, that really did sort of cruel any chance they had in the playoffs. And DeAndre wasn't prone to that either. He had an elbow injury very early in his time here. He didn't miss any games, but it sort of did really interrupt his pre-season, so it got him off to a bit of a slow start. But yeah, the expectations were that he would sort of take over as that number 1 option. And also there were question marks about how well he would adjust, because I understand he played a lot of college with UConn as a stretch 4. And the direction from Toronto was they really wanted him to develop as a 3-spot player. So there was a bit of an understanding with the fan base that it might take a bit of time to adjust to a different position to what he's been used to at college.
And how did he fare overall? Like, was he impressive? Was he a disappointment? Or what did you come away with?
Yeah, look, he was probably, to be honest, he was probably about what I expected. There's positives and negatives. I mean, first of all, just purely looking at his numbers, they held up pretty well. He averaged 15 points a game and about 8 rebounds a game. And I should stress here that these are 40-minute games, not the 48 that you guys are used to in the association. So you've got to sort of dial down the expectations a little bit with the numbers. So 15 and 8 were his averages, 2.5 offensive boards a game, averaged about a block a game. So certainly put up solid numbers for his first professional season. So those are the positives. The negatives, we probably didn't really see the progression that we thought we might see from, the first half of the season compared to the second, perhaps. I mean, even the two playoff games that Daniels played, and that's obviously a small sort of range of data to look at, but he had 14 and 4 and 9 and 5 in those 2 games respectively, playing 30 plus minutes in each. So it didn't really sort of take over games like we thought he might have been able to. And again, comparing to Ennis, didn't really have that same sort of killer instinct and ability to grab the game by the throat as Wildcats fans had been used to with Ennis the season before that. So that was probably one of the knocks on him. I mean, he did sort of tend to have moments where you thought, yep, this is a kid who could be something really special. But he did have a tendency at times to sort of drift in and out of games, which is a bit of a concern when you do look at his potential for an NBA role. So overall, on the whole, his numbers, as I say, were solid. There were some games where he did take over in the fourth quarter and led Perth to a win, but there were also times where you felt like you could see more from him. You felt like you wanted to see more from him. You wanted to see him be more aggressive, and you wanted to see him hone his skills a little bit more and develop a little bit more. So he did sort of leave Perth fans wanting more a little bit as the season went on.
And there's one thing that the Raptors are looking for right now at the small forward position. They're looking for 3-point shooting, and they're looking for defense. And they can't seem to get Terrence Ross is a good 3-point shooter, but he's an absolutely horrible defender. James Johnson can be argued is a good defender, but he literally cannot shoot the three. And you see that teams sag off of him and help other people, and it causes a bit of a disruption and kind of clamps down the offense a little bit because of his lack of 3-point shooting. So ideally, it's almost fashionable now to get a stretch 4 in the NBA and also a 3 and D guy, somebody who can shoot the 3 and get the D. How does Daniels fare from that sense, from a 3 and D sense, his 3-point shooting and his defense? Has he made any progression on that front? And do you think potentially he could be NBA ready in a year or so?
Yeah, look, I think he'd still need a fair bit of improvement when we're talking about being NBA ready. I'll start with the defense. His defense was one of the more promising aspects of his game. As I mentioned, he was about a block per game, has that great height and a massive wingspan. As we know, he tried to bulk up a fair bit when he was here. He arrived at the Wildcats at about 86 kilos. He had a goal to add almost 10 kilos to that frame and almost got there in the end. I think he was sort of 93, 94 kilos by the time the season finished, and I'm sure he's still trying to bulk up a little bit more than that. But the fact that he was still quite slight in his frame meant that he did struggle at times with the physicality, particularly on the offensive end, struggled to sort of absorb contact, and also the defensive end a little bit. But his interior defense is pretty sound. As far as 3-point shooting goes, he averaged a 34% clip from deep. That's 45 made from 132 attempts, so he had plenty of attempts. The 34% clip obviously is not ideal. It can be a lot better than that, and you'd want it to be a lot better than that if he is to become a 3 and D sort of guy. But it's not a bad outside shot. He's got a high release on it, and of course that coupled with his natural height makes it tough for defenders to stop. But look, if he does improve that outside shot, he could be someone who could help sort of space the floor and provide some defense. But I think he'd still have a lot of work to do before becoming a real sort of rotation 3 and D player at NBA level.
And that's a good point because his type of player are basically littered all over the development league these days. Those 6'7", 6'8" guys who or even 6'8" guys who have like a couple of things lacking. They don't either shoot the 3 or they can't defend, or they or they're a little slight of weight. So there's always so his type almost needs to be rounded in every facet of the game to a acceptable degree before you even think about the NBA. And it sounds like he's still got some ways to go, especially on 3-point shooting and kind of offensive efficiency before he gets to that level. Personally, I don't expect him to make the team next year. Maybe he'll get an invite back into the Raptors Summer League. And as I understand, there's during the summer months, June, July, August, there's no basketball to be played in Australia, correct?
Yeah, that's right. Right. There's nothing played here over that time. And Perth, the Wildcats organisation has made a habit of trekking over to the Summer League in the past few years, looking for that import because the teams here are allowed 2 overseas imports, of which Daniels was one last season. So they'll be looking for someone of a similar ilk, I think, in that sort of 3 spot. That can be like a Daniels or can be like a James Ennis.
And also, somewhat interesting sidebar to this conversation is that the Raptors are kind of aggressively looking at acquiring an NBADL franchise next season. I know the GM Asai Ujiri has been in talks with the NBA, and it's kind of been approved that the Raptors are okay to purchase an NBADL team or a D-League team. So that would, I think, if that does happen, the preference would certainly be for the Raptors to kind of bring some of these players closer to home so they can monitor them a little better and maybe give them occasional recalls to the big club rather than rather than sending him over to overseas where you can't really call them back. So just talk about how does the contract structure work here. So when the Raptors sent over Daniels, was it on a 1 year, 2 year team, and how does the recall structure work there? Can they recall him anytime they want, or how does that play out? Or is there a buyout? Or
Yeah, look, it was a 1 year deal, and my understanding was that there was a time, there was sort of a deadline sort of within about 2/3 of the season, the NBL season progressing, where before that time the Raptors could recall him if they wanted to. And then obviously once that deadline expires, which would have been a month or two out from the playoffs, there would have been a deal that he would have had to stay in Australia just because Perth wouldn't be able to replace him at that point with someone else on the roster. So it was a 1 year deal. My understanding is that Daniels, probably will go to that D-League team if it does eventuate. And I think that could be really good for him to have that motivation so close to the NBA team itself, and to be working so close with the guys involved with the Raptors, knowing exactly what parts of his game he needs to hone and he needs to develop, and seeing that the rewards are right under his nose if he's able to make those improvements.
Yeah, it's such a thin margin of error with second round picks. The Raptors already have Bruno Caboclo and Lucas Nogueira on the roster. They occupy the deep bench right now. They have the 20th pick again in this year's draft. If they do draft it, it's very difficult to see where a guy like DeAndre Daniels can find his way back into the big club. It's just the odds are kind of stacked against him at this point, and he almost has to go down the D-League route or something to kind of prove himself and maybe make an entry like James Ennis did, a couple of years after. Just one final question about Daniels is that it's like one thing that we're always we're harping on about in North America is a guy's motor, especially on defense. Like what is his effort level? What are his intensity levels throughout the game? Is he always engaged, or does he take possessions off? Is he really driven to improve? In terms of that, Daniels' quote unquote motor. What do you think of him there?
Yeah, look, he is a hard worker, and his defense was much improved as the season went on, and he was quite engaged. I mean, Perth has a real reputation as a club, as a hard-nosed defensive club in this league down here, and their point guard, their starting point guard, and their captain has been named Defensive Player of the Year for 5 consecutive seasons. So
wow, who's this guy?
Undisputed league. There's a guy called Damien Martin. He's a local Australian, but just a hard-nosed defender, just comes up with three and a bit steals per game, and is just, hands down the best defender in the league and sets a fine example. So there's a real sort of edict at Perth.
This is fascinating stuff. Sorry, I got to cut you off there. He's been the Defensive Player of the Year for 5 straight years running?
That's correct.
And he's
a
6'1" guy, just based on Wikipedia, and that's 30 years old. That's pretty impressive. Like, why hasn't he? Like, that should at least give him a sniff of the NBA, doesn't it, or at least a training camp invite?
Oh, yeah. Look, he's actually had a difficult time making the Australian national team. He's been really, really close. He's sort of always been the 13th or 14th man on the 12-man roster, simply because his offense hasn't quite been up to scratch in terms of point production. He's a good passer of the ball. His three-point shooting has improved, but that's always been the knock, is that he hasn't been able to give you enough offensively. But defensively, he's been one of the best players that you could ever hope to see. And as I say, that sort of has rubbed off onto his teammates, and I think DeAndre sort of really got an understanding of that early to improve his defense. As far as his mental sort of character goes, again, comparing to James Ennis. James Ennis, when he was here 2 seasons ago, was just such a competitor and was always dialed in. You'd see him at practice. He'd hit a 3 in scrimmage at practice, and he'd be celebrating it as he's running back on the floor at defense. Like, he just never sort of took a day off. He was always dialed in. Whereas with DeAndre, you sort of got the impression a few times at practice or during the game, something might go against him. He might have his head down. He might sort of go into his shell a little bit. And you just get the sense that maybe he needs to improve that sort of killer instinct and that sort of mental toughness aspect of his game, along with a few of the other things that we mentioned.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to give you a trivia question, kind of on the fly, put you on the spot a little bit. You know, there was another Australian guy the Raptors drafted a long time ago. Can you name him? Center?
Are you talking about Nathan Jowai?
Yes. How? What's Nathan been up to? Is he around? What's he doing?
He's in Europe somewhere, I believe. He had real problems with injuries. He would be in the Australian setup. He didn't play at the World Cup recently because he was injured, but he was with the team in terms of, you know, on the bench and providing support. He had real injury problems. I think it was his back, but he's stored in Europe somewhere. I couldn't tell you exactly the right country. It might be a Turkey or something like that.
Okay.
But, he was a terrific talent. He was Rookie of the Year in the Australian League here probably about 6 or 7 years ago, maybe a little bit more. An outstanding talent. They called him Baby Shaq. He just had a massive frame, still does have a massive frame, but I think that's starting to sort of catch up with him injury-wise now. But, he was an outstanding young talent.
Before we sign off, let's briefly talk about some Australian players in the NBA. Obviously, Andrew Bogut is very much in the playoff hunt right now with the Golden State Warriors. Is he the guy that obviously most people track in Australia in the NBA?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely he is. And he's been a really, really strong ambassador for Australian basketball. He's always happy to do media and sort of promote the game here in this country. The San Antonio connection has been really strong as well. There's 2 Australians there. Paddy Mills is a really popular figure down here, and Aaron Baines as well, who's, you know, one of their reserve centres. And we've seen a real sort of boom in Australian players in the NBA. Joe Ingles, as I said, was with Utah, and Dante Exum was that high first-round pick. You know, there's a real feeling that he's only going to get better. Matthew Dellavedova as well has turned into a really important role player at Cleveland. So we could well see Dellavedova up against Bogut's Warriors in an NBA final scenario in a few weeks' time. And Cam Bairstow is another Australian who's not seeing many minutes at the moment, but he's on the roster at Chicago, so they're still in the playoffs as well. So there's plenty going around, and there's also Ben Simmons, who's one of the best sort of high school prospects in the US, who's an Australian lad as well. So it's good times as far as young Australian talent making its way into the US and North America is concerned.
And just looking ahead to the Olympics, how's the Australian men's national team looking? Like, what are the expectations there in terms of what they should be achieving this time around?
Yeah, look, they're always somewhat there in the medal hunt. They've never taken a medal at men's level. At women's level, they have. At women's level, they're consistently finding the silver behind the US. But at men's level, their best finish is 4th at an Olympics. They should be there or thereabouts again next year. A lot of it hinges on Bogut's availability. We know he's had injury problems over the journey, and that really has sort of limited his availability for the national team. But if Bogut can be there, and then you look at that backcourt of Mills, Dellavedova, Exum continues to develop, that can be a really sort of strong core. So there's a real sort of hope and expectation that that Australian team can at least make sort of a final 8 at an Olympics and maybe try and push with a bit of luck for the medal places.
And just briefly, like when you attend games, do you see have you seen an increase in NBA scouts attending the NBL games there, or has that been kind of more or less the same over the years, or has there been more interest from the NBA in terms of just to checking out what Australia has to offer?
Yeah, look, I think there has been a little bit of increased interest. We've seen scouts, or we've seen sort of representatives from the NBA teams that, Toronto and also Miami as well over the past couple of seasons in Perth, with obviously Daniels and Ennis as well. So there is a bit of attention down here, and I think that Australia is being recognised, more and more as a breeding ground, as a place where NBA ready players can come from. But in addition to that, a lot of the young Australian talent does go to the United States early and take place in that college system. St Mary's on the West Coast, which is where Mills and Dellavedova have come from, has become sort of a real breeding ground for Australians to go to. So a lot of the young talent does make its way over to the US early, but there are some players like Joe Ingles, as I said, who did spend a significant amount of time in the NBL before sort of making his way over to the NBA. So I think it's gradually attracting the attention of the world.
I just looked up on Basketball Reference. There was one more Australian that played for the Raptors. It was David Anderson, who was, I think, as part of the New Orleans Hornets or something, and then he came over. Had a cup of coffee with the Raptors. I recall him being a decent mid-range shooter, and I just have fond memories of David Anderson.
Yeah, he has a really good mid-range shot for a man of his size, and he's been a really important part of Australia's national team setup, particularly sort of in lieu of Bogut's availability. He's been, I think he was captain at one stage across the journey, so he's been a real sort of important figurehead for the national team.
You watching the NBA playoffs?
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm just wondering what you guys are going to do now. What's the next step for the Raps as far as improvement, and what's the sort of vibe in Toronto after that exit?
I think we're still kind of shell-shocked after what has happened to us. Having won the Atlantic quite comfortably, racking up a franchise high 49 wins. Expectations were that you would at least get out of the first round, and really most of the fans were kind of hoping to get Milwaukee in that first round, a very inexperienced team who you could potentially handle. Just because they have one of the worst shooting point guards ever, but as it turned out, Washington snuck in there and we lost to a lower seed, and we lost for a lot of reasons. I think the coach is taking a lot of heat right now for the way he matched up with Paul Pierce and John Wall and Bradley Beal. It's a bit of a sense of doom right now, but I think that'll pass over the next month or so as the draft comes along and free agency comes along. I think half the fans kind of want to trade one of Kyle Lowry or DeMar DeRozan and blow it up, and the other half kind of want to stay the course. It's really everywhere. Like my opinion is that to really compete and give yourself a chance in the NBA to win, you kind of need a tier 1 star, and the Raptors don't have that right now, and they need to acquire one if possible through some means. But that's more easier said than done. But the scary part is that the East this year has been quite crappy, but next year they're going to get better. Like Boston, Indiana's going to be back. They were, riddled with injuries this year. We saw progress from obviously Washington, and Charlotte's going to get better. So all these teams who had kind of down years are going to come back and become stronger. So it's going to be tougher and tougher to make the playoffs in the East and compete in the East. And this year you had a great opportunity to come out of the first round, but to answer your question, it's a bit of sense of doom. And Masai Ujiri, who took over a couple of years ago, has sort of never really blown up the roster. The team is still really Brian Colangelo's team, who was a GM before him. And I think this summer he's had enough time to kind of look and see what's on his hands. And this is the first real summer where he's got to make some actual moves and not just re-sign his own free agent. So there's a lot to do on the roster. That's why we were kind of looking at DeAndre Daniels and seeing if he's able to come over and help out on that wing position, which is probably the second most position in need of help after power forward. So the Raptors have a lot of work to do, and Ujiri has a lot of work to do.
They certainly do. I'll be watching it closely, and hopefully they can turn it around and go deep into the playoffs next season. Yeah.
What's your pick for the title this year? You've been obviously your Spurs connection has been extinguished quite early in the playoffs, surprisingly a little bit. But now that the Spurs are out, Golden State or is it somebody else?
Yeah, look, I really like Golden State, and I'm not, saying anything that's controversial or surprising there. I mean, they've just been so impressive with what they've done this season. Defensively as well, just really gets sort of overlooked by what Steph Curry can do and what Klay Thompson can do and all the rest of it. But defensively, they've been so much better than your average sort of fan might realise, and I think they'll certainly get through the West, even though they've got a bit of a series on their hands right now against Memphis. But I think they'll pull through that And then, I think they'll be too strong for a Cleveland or a Chicago or an Atlanta in the East.
Yeah, a dark horse pick other than Golden State that you might sneak in for the title?
Yeah, the Clippers were super impressive against San Antonio. I followed that series really closely. Obviously, Chris Paul, what he did in Game 7 was incredible, considering he wasn't at 100% fitness. And when you've got the best pure point guard in the league, coupled with Blake Griffin, coupled with what DeAndre Jordan can do, and obviously Doc Rivers is a coach who's been there and done that and is no stranger to playoffs. So they certainly can't be underestimated.
Mm-hmm. Sounds good. So we'll look forward to that. And so Chris Robinson, thanks again for joining us, man, for the great overview of what our man Daniels is up to there, and a great overview of the basketball league in Australia. Talk to you soon, man, and we'll stay in touch.
Not a problem. Great to chat. Thanks, Zara.
Thanks, man.